Welcome back to Mac Music Review. In this special episode, I had so much fun going over the best albums of the 2010s. I thought, why not go over the best albums of the 2000s? Because to me, really the music that I grew up listening to was the music from the 2000s and the 2010s, of course, because it's closer to the time that I grew up in listening to music. I wasn't really I wasn't really listening to music in the 2000s the way I do now. But I still gravitated towards a lot of the stuff from the 2000s. So this is the music that's kind of like important to me. And a lot of the albums on this list are actually things, and in the honorable mentions are things that I didn't really listen to a lot, like back when I started to really listen to music, or stuff I listened to for a really long time, but stuff that since becoming a music critic and since listening to a lot of critically acclaimed music I have come across. First, starting with some honorable mentions, and we're just gonna kind of rush through these fast as possible so the video doesn't run too long. Here we go. My first honorable mention is the album Vampire Weekend by Vampire Weekend. Their debut album, yes, was actually released in 2008. These guys have become a staple of alternative music, winning 2 Grammys for Best Alternative Album. There are very few alternative bands who have won, or artists who have won 2 Best Alternative Album Grammys. So that kind of goes to show. This album didn't win anything, but, you know, great introduction to Vampire Weekend. A lot of people, some people would say this is their best. A lot of people would say Modern Vampires of the City is their best. Still, really great introduction to the band. Really great debut album. Another really great album from this decade, from the 2000s, is In Rainbows by Radiohead. This album is really great. There's not a lot I can say about it that, I mean, I will go into detail on this album because I actually am going to officially review this on the channel when I get to my R's. In fact, Radiohead is like the only band that had the letter R in them that I ended up reviewing. So we'll talk about this album as well as Kid A in the future. And that's another honorable mention, is Kid A. Radiohead got 2 honorable mentions because Radiohead really, they were extremely important in the 90s for OK Computer, but they really dominated the 2000s. If there's any decade that Radiohead dominated, it was the 2000s. And specifically with these 2 albums, Hail to the Thief is also really great, so I might as well give that a shout out. I wasn't planning on giving that a shout out, but it's one of my favorite Radiohead albums. It's really, really awesome. So yeah, we'll just say In Rainbows, Hail to the Thief, Kid A, all fantastic albums released in the 2000s. Narrow Stairs by Death Cab for Cutie. This came right at the end of the 2000s, right at the end of the decade in 2009, and has become a fan favorite Death Cab for Cutie album since. It was kind of their last album that was well received, and it wasn't even like that well received until their 2010 albums, which were not well received by critics, but I enjoyed very much regardless. I like In Rainbows. I like Narrow Stairs a lot. It's a good album. Not gonna lie. And finally, before I get into my top 10, Neon Bible by Arcade Fire. If I had to pick a personal favorite Arcade, well, I'll talk about this in a second. But anyway, we'll talk about this in just literally very soon. But Neon Bible is absolutely fantastic. From a music perspective, from a vocal perspective, from a lyrical perspective. It's the most slept on, the most underrated Arcade Fire album. Pitchfork, it's like as far as Pitchfork goes, on their high rated albums, this is their lowest rated, like, critically acclaimed album. Like, they gave all their other, you know, they didn't like Everything Now, but among their critically acclaimed albums, this was like the one that they kind of shoved under the rug, and that's a huge injustice because this is a really great album. Number 10, we're getting right into this list, and no introduction needed to Funeral by Arcade Fire. Pitchfork said this was the second best album of the decade. They absolutely loved this. AllMusic gave it 5 stars. Everybody gave it 5 stars. It's got a 90 on Metacritic. It's one of the most critically acclaimed albums ever made. And you know what? I don't love it. It's not, it had to be in this top 10 list because it is an essential album of the 2000s. It is really fantastic. But to me, personally, Neon Bible resonates a lot more with me. Like, that one just the lyrics, the messages in the songs, the music, even everything about it, just I enjoyed Neon Bible a lot more, but this is the one that everyone says is, like, without a doubt, the best Arcade Fire album. It is pretty fantastic, but not my personal favorite. Still, definitely, easily one of the best albums of the 2000s. 21 Pilots. Man, what's crazy about me putting this album in the list is one, this is the least popular 21 Pilots album. This is the one that barely anybody listens to. A lot of people say it's weird or boring or too long. And it's the members of the band were completely different. This is really an entirely different 21 Pilots than the ones that dominated the 2010s. And ironically, even though 21 Pilots dominated the 2010s, I didn't put any of their albums in the top 15 best albums of 2010s. I just didn't think they made it. But I think they do crack the best albums of the 2000s, ironically, even though they only did one album, their first album. Songwriting, music, vocals are all absolutely fantastic. This is a legendary, this album is a classic in my mind. I absolutely love 21 Pilots' self-titled album. Definitely check it out, especially if you love 21 Pilots. You gotta go back to the roots. This is a really great album. Yes. Number 8. The only album in this top 10 that I own on vinyl. Absolutely fantastic. Daft Punk. Let's go. Discovery. Not the best Daft Punk album, believe it or not. Random Access Memories is actually better, in my opinion. I talked about that on my Daft Punk ranked video. I can link that in the description if I remember. I might forget. If I do, you can just search it. Just Mac Music Review, Daft Punk ranked. It'll pop up. Discovery is awesome. It's one of the best EDM albums ever. One of the best electronic albums ever, I should say. But this really does pass for EDM. Most of these songs are things you can dance to, is electronic dance music, and it's just absolutely awesome. This album has aged phenomenally. While I don't think it's as innovative, I don't think it is as groundbreaking as Random Access Memories, still a totally legendary album. Believe it or not, there was an electronic album released in the 2000s that I actually think was better than Discovery, and that is Since I Left You by the Avalanches. This album is incredible. I have not given this album the time that I've given Discovery. I haven't listened to this album as much, but I do think it is better. Believe it or not, I think the production on this thing is just awesome. Just really, really phenomenal production. And the thing about this album is it's a sample album. I've never heard another sample album. But like every single inch, every moment of this album is generated from samples. I heard there's like over 600 samples on this thing that make up the album. And the songs are really incredible. This album is totally unique. It's really extremely special and extremely, a really, really great album. And actually, my brother owns this on vinyl. So I guess there's 2 vinyls. Well, I don't personally own it, but my brother actually does own this one on vinyl. But still, easily one of the best albums of the 2000s. Brother Sister by Me Without You. Me Without You, since listening to really the album that made me love Me Without You was, the album that got me into Me Without You is actually Untitled. I didn't start listening to that until I read all this critical acclaim for Untitled. Everyone's saying Untitled's the best album ever. It's their best album. It's a 5-star album. I heard that and I said, okay. And I listened to it. And I got an honorable mention in my best albums of the 2010s. But Pale Horses got in my top, 6 or top 5. It was either 6 or 5 on my top albums of the 2010s. Of the 2010s. And this album is what a lot of people say is their best album. It's between this and Untitled for most people. And I think this is a lot better than Untitled. On this album is one of the ones where it's a lot less hard. So the 2 albums that came before this are A.B. Life and Catch for Us the Foxes. And this album is different because it's more melodic. It has more folk influence. The music is, generally speaking, more slow and more kind of layered and less aggressive, and that just works wonders for the band. I think these guys really excel when they do stuff that's not just super hard rock. I think their hard rock stuff is awesome, but I think they actually sound better when they're doing slower stuff like this, and it's absolutely fantastic. This is another folky album, Fleet Foxes. You know, Father John Misty, my favorite singer-songwriter of all time, could not, made number one album of the 2010s in my opinion with Pure Comedy. Didn't quite make the 2000s list because he didn't exist in 2000s as an artist, but he was the drummer for Fleet Foxes, and guess what? Fleet Foxes' debut album is absolute gold. This thing is the most pleasant. This is ear candy. This is music that makes you feel happy, or that makes you feel this sense of pleasantness. It's just, this album radiates this amazing positive energy and this life and this lushness that's like really hard to describe. You really just have to listen to it. But seriously, do not sleep on the album Fleet Foxes by Fleet Foxes. It's absolutely incredible. Hot Fuss by Hot Fuss by The Killers is one, you could say this is the best alternative rock debut album ever. It's one of the first really popular, successful alternative rock. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. There was a lot of stuff before this in the 90s. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Hot Fuss is insanely awesome. Like, seriously, it's like the most insanely awesome rock album ever, despite critics totally sleeping on it, which is just tragic because this album, every single song is awesome on this album. Even the ones that don't sound that awesome eventually build up to something that is awesome. Like Andy, You're a Star, at first you're like, what is this weird song? But eventually it really pays off. And even songs like the last song, which are really slow and drawn out, works wonders. Very great song. Really fantastic band. Really fantastic album from a band that was never able to top this or even get all that close. But Hot Fuss is a legendary alternative debut album that you really need to listen to. What's really insane about putting The Moon in Antarctica at number 3 in my best albums of the 2000s is that why in the world would it not be number 1? This album is absolutely, like, the closest, like Pitchfork gave it a 9.8, so basically, and I agree with that, this is like the closest you can get to perfect without being perfect. It's like an inch away from perfect. The songwriting is just absolutely like devastating, incredibly complex. The vocals are classic Modest Mouse, one of the best things. Modest Mouse is my all-time favorite band, and this album really proves why. I think, you know what? I think Strangers to Ourselves is one of the most underrated albums ever. I put that in my best albums of the 2010s. And I think that's also a great representation because that's the album that really got me into them. But this is their masterpiece. This along with, well, no. This is their masterpiece. I'll say that. This is the best Modest Mouse album and definitely something that you should listen to. The more I listened to Transatlanticism when making this list, the higher up it got on my list until actually hitting number 2 and surpassing Modest Mouse, which is crazy. Once again, this is one of my all-time favorite bands ever. They're like my second all-time favorite band is Death Cab for Cutie, who really did their stuff in the 2000s. You know, you got Something About Airplanes, which is pretty fantastic, their debut album. And then we have The Facts and We're Voting Yes. And then you got this one, which is known as their masterpiece, rightly so. It's a masterful album. The songwriting on this thing is absolutely fantastic. What's really great about this album is it's also really accessible. The Moon and Antarctica, I can't say that. The Moon and Antarctica, number 3 best album of the 2000s, is really hard to get into. It's really, Modest Mouse is not a super attractive band to most people because the songwriting is so weighty and heavy and the vocals are weird and the music is messy. But this is an album that you can totally get into, that you can totally immediately see that is how masterful and amazing it is. And this album is absolutely incredible. I mean, honestly, this is really one of the best albums ever made. Number 1, this is possibly my favorite album of all time in terms of actual enjoyment. Because while I gave Pure Comedy number 1 of the 2010s, it's a very dark album, and this is something that is so insanely fun. what's really remarkable about this album is how many songs it has. It has like 21 tracks, including the skits. And every single track, including the skits, is really fantastic, except for Gold Digger. That's not the best song ever. That's the worst song on the album, even though it's the most popular. Still not a bad song, so there's not a single bad song on this album. And every song besides that is absolutely fantastic. This is a insanely consistent album, and it's so much fun. Kanye's fantastic. The guests on this thing are fantastic. They have the guy that sings for Maroon 5, and he absolutely kills it. And that's crazy to say that, because Maroon 5 is like the worst thing ever. And he's on this album, and he absolutely kills it. And so does every other guest on this thing. Jay-Z, literally everybody. And there's a lot of guests on this thing, and that's really crazy that they all do this well. Kanye absolutely kills it. The lyrics, the bars, and the production especially on this album is all through the roof. Late Registration is the best rap album ever made, arguably. I think it's the greatest rap album ever made. Fantastic album. Thank you for watching the video. Have a great rest of your day. I finished filming everything, and I realized there's 2 albums from the 2000s that I totally forgot about, that are absolutely worth mentioning and that are some of the best albums of the 2000s. Not in the top 10, these are some 2 honorable mentions. Are one, Whatever People Say, and That's What I'm Not by Arctic Monkeys. The best Arctic Monkeys album, I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's not my personal favorite, but this album is pretty fantastic from a music perspective, from a, like, I guess from a songwriting perspective, and, you know, vocally it's pretty amazing. Great album. That is not my personal favorite, but I think it's one of the best albums of the 2000s, but my personal favorite is Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, but I do think this is their best album. And then there's The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. Don't know how I forgot about that. Absolutely legendary album. There's really not a lot I need to say about that. Needle Drop recently reviewed it for his episode of, for an episode of Classics Week. He reviewed it, said it was a classic. You know, didn't give it a score. It was one of those classic video reviews. One of those classic album video reviews. I can't talk, I'm sorry. But, yeah, 2 fantastic albums I forgot to mention when I was initially going over the honorable mentions. Check those out as well. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for watching the video.